Packy McCormick, welcome to the deep end.
Great to be in the deep end. Thanks for having me.
We were joking before the recording started how it's actually decently difficult to sum up everything that you're doing in a ultra coherent narrative. But then you did us the favor of announcing Not Boring Capital today. So we have a big item slash news piece to discuss. We'll put a quick pause on that because something I'm looking to do, especially because this is going out to a lot of folks who might not have heard of you on the actual podcast. I'd like to find a story business case study that really helps people understand the unique editorial voice you're bringing to the fore here. You made this joke in a piece that we'll link in the show notes that you had to ask yourself, what am I doing differently than Ben Thompson? And the example you gave, a very poorly yet well done Photoshop job of the Mickey Mouse Club crew from the 1990s. For those of you who were not, alive during the 90s or early aughts, this was Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake, Christina Aguilera, this really bright shining moment of Disney brand synchronicity here. So you use this example of the Mickey Mouse Club to explain the idea of creative destruction. So let's just jump in there as an introduction to your thought and how you're thinking about things.
Oh man, we're going way back. So first of all, thanks so much for having me, and you're welcome on the fund news because the newsletter is a little bit all over the place in terms of summarizing what we're up to. But yeah, so this goes back to, I think I probably wrote that piece in April of 2020. So we were at the beginning of the pandemic. I had gone through ODF2. I was, thinking about starting an in-person social club, a little bit of Soho House meets college extracurriculars. And then COVID hit, and obviously an in-person thing wasn't going to work. I had this little newsletter on the side, and I'd been dancing around kind of what I was going to write about. The thing that I liked writing about was tech and business strategy, but I was like, well, Ben Thompson does it and he's the best and nobody's ever going to be better than Ben Thompson. But then when the newsletter became kind of my full-time thing and not just a side thing, I was like, well, damn, like the only thing that I really actually want to do every single week if I'm going to be writing is talking about tech, finance, economics, all these things, and strategy. And so how can I be different than somebody like a Ben Thompson? I was like, well, what if I just combined pop culture and all of this stuff and like just made it a little bit of like Ben Thompson and Bill Simmons? And so one of the first essays that I wrote, kind of sitting in the beginning of the pandemic when people were losing their jobs and there were these job lists going around all the time of like, oh man, here's all the WeWork employees who just lost their jobs. And here's all the company X employees who lost their jobs. And like, please hire these people. And things seemed really, really bleak at the time. And the point of that piece was to kind of say like, look, that like creative destruction is like a known thing. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about it. It's something that happens when, things need to be destroyed to let kind of new things bloom out of them. And so I tried to apply that kind of economic theory to what was happening in the pandemic. And the way that I did that in, a quote, not boring way was to say like, look, imagine how pathetic it would be if Justin Timberlake, Christina Aguilera, Felicity, all these superstars were just stuck in the Mickey Mouse Club at like 40 something years old and, still showing up on like the Disney Channel every day. It must have seemed really hard when they canceled that show back in the day, but it led to all these people being able to go maximize their own potential when they got kind of unshackled from the Mickey Mouse Club. And I think something is going to happen kind of similar in, startups and tech and in unemployment generally. And I think for the most part, that's actually kind of happened. There's been this absolute explosion. Obviously On Deck is both a reason for that and a beneficiary of that. But there's been this huge explosion of people going out and either joining small companies or starting their own company or going and joining the creator economy or doing all these things that when they were like just comfortable enough and earning a salary inside a job, they couldn't do. But now once they didn't have a choice, like me, I had to shut the company down. So I started writing. Like, other people had to got fired. And so they had to go figure out what they really wanted to do. And so I think it's led to this, huge wellspring of creativity over the past, 18 months since the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's just a quick little personal thing for me. I wouldn't have moved to New York City from DC if it wasn't for the pandemic. So I think in all of our lives, we're going to find one little to big structural change in our lives that came here. Something I'm curious about though, let's say the pandemic hadn't happened, because as you basically referenced Soho House in person, I couldn't think of a worse suited company for April, May 2020. Do you think the business would have succeeded without a pandemic?
Not boring?
No, not boring. It's because the actual like in-person part, because I think what's interesting when you write about that business, you imply that even before you actually got hit by COVID, you weren't quite finding product market fit. So I'm just curious about how you think about the world without the pandemic.
I think that the pandemic saved me from launching a business that would have been really fun, right? Like it would have been fun. We were doing debate clubs. They were fun. Like this whole thing would have been really nice, but I was really like, because I'm a good writer and I can like write convincing stuff, I was like sitting in front of a computer every day and like trying to write my way into believing that there was an actual business there. And anytime I talked to other people about it, they'd be like, oh, cool. Like that sounds, like that was my wife's reaction, my sister's reaction, my mom's even reaction, and like all of that. And so, I think the people around me knew it. I kind of knew that it wasn't, at least a very scalable idea. The other thing was, even a year ago, maybe that would have been a good idea. But in the beginning of the pandemic and leading up to it, there was actually a ton of interest in starting in-person social clubs of all sorts. So not only was it, a tough atoms-based, hard to scale, people-based idea, but it was that in a crowded space. And I was having a hard time figuring out who the exact target customer was. Like that's why I came up with not boring in the first place, because I was trying to define the demographic. And I was like, I don't know, like they're not boring. And then I decided to run with that as the name for the club and then the name for the newsletter. But yeah, I don't think it would have worked, but I think I'm really stubborn. And I think I'd probably still be sitting here trying to make it work today. And it would just be a totally different path.
Yeah. Something that I want to hit before we get to the actual fundraise that you've done. This idea of writing yourself into believing something is true is interesting, because part of your model, both as an investor and then as an actual newsletter writer, is, for example, with the newsletter, you'll do a sponsored post where you'll write about a company that you're interested in. And then obviously when you're looking at the actual investor side of things, you're saying you're working with storytelling and those different parts. How do you not just write yourself into thinking that a company is really legitimate? Because you're a really excellent writer. I really enjoy your work. I could see myself sending you something mediocre, but you're actually capable of writing it up into something semi-coherent that could maybe convince people. So how do you, both as a person who's writing for an audience, but also someone who's doing thinking, because another reference that I think Jake Singer referenced was the idea that like writing makes you a better investor. How do you help this process keep your mind straight, yet also not actually drink the Kool-Aid?
Totally. That's I'd say one of the biggest challenges. And so I've been super proactive about it. Every time I write about a company, like, if I'm writing a sponsored deep dive, the way that those work is that I get more demand for sponsored deep dives than anything else, like regular top of newsletter advertising, companies wanting me to just write about whatever. Like probably for every sponsored deep dive I write, I get 6. And I think it's actually increased recently, maybe like 8 for every one that I write of people who want me to write it. So there's definitely that filtering process up front a little bit, where before I give myself the chance to talk myself into something, I can say like, no, I actually don't think this is a good idea. Or I've looked at this space before and I don't think this is the right approach, or X, Y, and Z thing. So I talk myself out of a lot of it up front. For the ones that I do end up writing about, a big part of my interview process with the founders is like, please, like I am an idiot on this space. Like, your space way better than I do. The last thing I want to have happen is that I write this glowing thing about your company, and then somebody who knows what they're talking about says, oh, cool, well, you missed X, Y, Z, all of these challenges that the company faces. And did you know they had a lawsuit against them? I was like, you have to tell me everything up front, or this is just not going to go particularly well. And so I'll get, the big kind of knocks on the company from the founders themselves. And then I'll go dig in. I'll talk to people I know in the industry. So a lot of my time is spent researching the positives, obviously. And that's most of what I write in these pieces, because I only pick companies that I'm bullish on. But I will spend a big chunk of time going out and trying to find the bear case against the company, so that I don't just let myself get overly excited.
Yeah, so let's get to Not Boring Capital, which you just announced today, totally just for us. That totally had nothing to do with your broader life plans and actual strategic objectives. You gave us a bit of a news hook here. So let's just start there. Like, what is Not Boring Capital? How does it relate to what you're doing with the syndicate and the general way that you thought about the newsletter?
Not Boring Capital is, I said when I announced it, an $8 million fund. I also opened it up to let readers kind of back the fund. And in 2.5 hours, 209 people have submitted interest to invest $10 million. So it might be a $10 million fund to invest in early stage companies, pre-seed, kind of through Series B, and I'll even go a little bit beyond. So really not tied to stage. And the thing that I'm looking for is companies with these like complex, hard to understand plans that like you need to kind of follow one step at a time towards this really big vision. I called them world builders in a piece that I wrote before. We could talk about that. But I think it's really interesting when companies find a unique wedge into a big market. I think most of the big markets, if you try to take the easy approach to going to win one, it's too late. Like the easy approach has been tried and failed, or someone's doing it, but you can go win big markets still by taking these like long winding plans. Like Tesla's master plan, I think, is a great example of that, or Jeff Bezos starting with books, or, more recently I've written about a lot of startups that are doing it now, but like those kinds of companies that are going after something really, really huge, but maybe it's hard to see upfront at the stage that they're at exactly what they're going after and why it could be really huge. So those are the companies that I love investing in the most. I've done already out of the fund in the first quarter, 20 investments, and kind of just continuing at that pace. So it's been fast and furious, but it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's that's great. And I'm smiling because I'm thinking about what you're describing about complex. So I'm seeing the exact inverse of your fund as like Uber for X. So it's very straightforward to complex. So can you help us understand then so for example, something that's public and you can discuss, what's the most complex? It wouldn't quite translate immediately into the Uber for X example company that you're looking at or that you've invested in, and as a way of understanding what you mean by the complex thing navigating a difficult problem part.
Totally. So the one that I wrote about recently, there's a couple that I wrote about recently that I think fit this well, but one in particular. So there's a company called NextHealth. And when they just raised, and I invested in their Series B, led by Josh Buckley. And when I talk to people about it, they're like, isn't that like SaaS for dentist offices or something? And I was like, haha, like it is today. And so what NextHealth realized is like no teenager in their bedroom like goes and hacks on healthcare problems. Like they have to deal with HIPAA. There's no clean data. Like it's really messy to build products for healthcare. And so people just don't do it. And like maybe they build simple stuff, or maybe they build for, the high end of the market who can pay out of pocket, and you don't have to worry about insurance or any of that kind of stuff. So what NextHealth realized is like you need to build an API and then ultimately build a platform that lets other people build healthcare products on top of it, which a million people have thought of before. Also, like, way easier said than done. The approach that they took to do this was literally building Shopify for doctors' offices or Shopify for SMB medical offices, starting with dentists, so that they could go in one at a time, sell this SaaS to dentist office. And as they did, they were able to integrate by using the dentist credentials into one of the 1,000 fragmented electronic health record or EHR systems that these doctors use. Once they were able to integrate into one, they were able to map it, and they had that one. And then you go to the next dentist office and you get that EHR. And so they're stitching together the thousands of disparate EHRs, one SaaS sale at a time. So they're using that as their Trojan horse. Then they started to build an API, which they built for, dentistry related use cases first, because that's the records that they have, on top of which companies now like Quip and Smile Direct Club, which is a public company, are building. They're going to do that across a bunch of different verticals, and they already are. And they're doing, $8 million in revenue just for the SaaS product alone, which is pretty impressive. And so like that's a good business on its own, but the API piece is starting to work out. Once they have that, they really want to build a platform where not only do they have, the technical pipes and the way to get the data in, but they also have this platform where they have all of these doctors and they have all of these patients. And so if you're a developer, then you can build on top of this platform that NextHealth is building and kind of just plug in immediately both sides of the equation that you need in order to be a successful product. And then they're going to build some, just to make it a little more complex, some kind of customer facing products of their own that tie all this stuff together and can hopefully be kind of like that one place. It's crazy that right now, like I don't know my doctor's name. I don't know the last time I had a doctor's appointment. Like I don't know any of these things about my personal health, and I'm bad. I haven't been to the doctor's office in like 10 years, but even a person who goes often, like I don't know where you keep that information. Ultimately, they should be able to just deliver you like, here's your health in one app. And I think they'll end up building that at some point in the future.
I asked for the perfect inverse of Uber for X, and you 120% delivered on that. So there's a question then, especially for people in the audience. What is your advice for founders, operators, builders, whatever, in these spaces where they have complex stories to tell? Because to add one quick thing of this, to what degree do you think a complex story is just something that's structurally affecting a company? And then to what degree is that you just didn't do the work of actually simplifying it? Right. Cause there's just like a bad version of this where it's just like, I've had a bunch of like harebrained ideas that people didn't understand. And I was like, oh, I'm just too visionary. And it just turns out I was not particularly good at making slide decks. So how do you differentiate? And then how do you advise people actually go through that process?
Yeah, well, it's tough, right? Like I actually don't do a lot of pre-seed investing. I do a little bit of pre-seed, but I don't think I'm smart enough to figure all of this out in the beginning. And I don't think founders often know in the beginning fully exactly where it's going to go. So Next Health is a Series B company. There's another Series B company that I'm looking at that has like maybe more complex of a plan because it like really involves like human psychology and behavior to get it right. The way that they're approaching it is they have this master plan in secret. And like I had to go through levels of security to be able to get their master plan downloaded from them and like, walk through the whole thing with them. The way that they're thinking about doing it though, is like a few steps at a time, executing on it, and then looking back and like signposting and saying like, all right, so here's part one of the plan. We just executed on this thing. Here's all the stuff that we had to do that wasn't linear in order to get to that point. And so like, I think that's a really interesting approach where you don't wait for the end, but you don't just stand there waving your arms in the beginning and saying like, look, like go out and like look a million years in the future. And like, this is our master plan. You have to do really well on that first thing that you're executing on. So the company that I'm talking about, which I can't disclose yet, but that company is like on fire from a traction perspective and a customer onboarding perspective. Next Health, like I said, is doing $8 million in SaaS revenue. Unit 21, which I just read about, I think another phenomenal example where like their product is, so they make essentially like a no-code tool for ops people to be able to at first detect fraud and do anti-money laundering stuff. Their product is generalizable. It's like a recommendation. It's like built the same way that Amazon's recommendation engine is, where it just says like, oh, if you did this, like you're probably like someone who did that and whatever. It doesn't care what the data is, but they've had to be so disciplined for the first 3 years of having all of their language and their go-to-market and their salespeople and everything focused on that one particular small use case. And they've absolutely crushed in that space. They have huge customers. They have all the kind of startup customers. So like by just staying really focused in the beginning, they have that. And then they brought me in to say like, all right, now you can tell people like the rest of the plan now that we're executing and we just raised from Tiger and all of that kind of stuff. But I would say don't be too crazy publicly unless you can back some stuff up in the beginning.
So the thing that we're basically talking about is your world builders idea. And in the PC reference, you compare world builders to shot callers. So it'd be great to have you just explain what a world builder is and how that contrasts with the shot caller.
Yeah,
with of course the pop culture references that make it digestible and understandable.
Yeah. So shot caller, I was using the idea of Babe Ruth or, Mark Messier or these like famous athletes who have said like, I'm going to hit a home run or we're going to win the NHL championship or whatever, like people who call their shot in sports. And my argument was that like, startups try to do that all the time where they're saying like, I see this huge market. We're going to raise a ton of money. Like Uber is this. Quibi, I think, is like my favorite example of this, where it's like, here's this big market. We're just going to raise a shitload of money and we're going to go out and we're going to win this market because like, we've done this before. We can go do this. And the argument is that works in sports because sports is a tame problem. Like, the rules of the game. Mm-hmm. There's a time, unless it's soccer and time like kind of runs a little bit longer, but like mostly it's time bound. Like the objective is incredibly, incredibly clear. You're competing with like one other team. And so because it's a tame problem, like it's much easier to say like, that is the goal and I'm going to hit that goal. And like, that's it. And you can tell whether they got it right or not. That doesn't apply as well to startups, which are just full of these like wicked problems, which are hard to define and ever changing and all of that. And so in startups, I argued that the best approach is to be, to go after a really big market, is to be a world builder. And you call your shot kind of like internally, like write it down somewhere early and say like, this is what we're going after. Sometimes you can expose it publicly. Like the best examples of this, like I mentioned, are, Elon Musk laid out Tesla's kind of crazy master plan, where you start with these expensive high-end cars and then you just increase production and you bring the cost down and then it's mass market and then you save the planet and all that. And he's actually like executing on it. He executed on plan 1, made plan 2, and it's continuing to execute. Jeff Bezos, there's this like phenomenal old clip, which I linked to in the piece, where he's like this goofy guy on just like a camcorder back in the 90s saying like, look, we're starting with books because books have a ton of SKUs and they're like perfectly designed for the internet, but it's not just going to be books. Essentially was his like implication in the piece. It's like, look, we're starting with books because like you just can't do this as well offline. And so he had the same kind of plan where it's like you start with this like really non-obvious little thing, and then you work your way up, and like all of a sudden, not only are you the everything store, but you're AWS and you own Whole Foods, and it just like continues to kind of expand. And so those are the types of companies that I think are really fascinating, because I do think that is how you get like I can't think of many counter examples. Like it's Facebook and Google, just like someone had to be the big social network. Someone had to be the big search engine. And like those were just like prizes that you needed to throw a bunch of technical muscle at and get there first. But there's not a lot of like just huge opportunities like that. They're just like such very clear, kind of big winner take all things. So now you need to like pick your niche and then like really kind of go up market from there.
I want to play a quick alternate history game given your framework, because I'm a OG Quibi fan. I subscribed until the very end. I'm one of the weird people. I was the guy who subscribed on day one. Yeah. I watched Liam's Hemver. I thought it was fun, but it was more at a meta level. But like that being said, do you think there's a world where Quibi could have taken a different path within like the shot caller versus world builder model? Because part of the argument was they had to raise a bunch of money because content is expensive. So is the lesson here that there are just spaces where Hollywood doesn't quite translate to tech and venture in ways that other things do? Like how do you think about the Quibi story within your framework?
This is why I am a writer and an investor and not and a failed entrepreneur, because I don't know what the path for Quibi would have been. And like a bunch of people try to win media and win content. So like their approach was one approach, and like maybe it works. Like maybe there's an alternate history where that does work and the pandemic doesn't happen and everybody really does want a 10-minute thing to watch while they're on the subway or their morning commute. I think just so much about their approach was off. Like it just felt like you put a couple old people and some consultants in a room and tried to like guess what millennials and Gen Z wanted, when like there were just so many things that like so many intricacies of that they got wrong, that I think if they had like started a little bit smaller and maybe worked their way up, they would have figured things out without blowing $1.75 billion or whatever it was on the way up, or at least that was the valuation. I'm not sure exactly how much they raised. Like, for example, having a mobile video thing where mobile was like the only way that you could access it, that you were not allowed to share. Like if you're going to go mobile first, you have to enable sharing. And like they did when it was too late, when they'd already become a joke. But like that's one of your key advantages, is that you have this mobile content that people should be able to share and like write on and like make memes on. Like that is why you do mobile. And they didn't do that. And they took it like an old kind of studio, own your IP and like really control it approach to it that just like didn't work. So that I think was as offensive as like the shot calling piece was just that like, it wasn't this like organic thing that bubbled up with this master plan. It was really just like, we're going all in on this new form factor. And like, I don't know, hopefully it works. And so like, that was the thing, like, because they didn't have to think of a master plan because they raised so much money, they were able to just like throw money at the problem. And I think that creates lazy thinking, right? Like WeWork, I used to work at a company called Breather, which competed with WeWork, and they're doing fine now. They're public, and Breather just sold for $3 million. So like they win this one. But, I think that WeWork faced a similar challenge where they just said like, we're going to go win real estate. And so they took a ton of money and just signed a bunch of bad leases, paid brokers 100% commissions to acquire customers, like did all these things that like, if you think it's a winner take all market, which real estate is not, like maybe kind of makes sense, but they certainly don't make you a good company, and they certainly make you operationally messy, and you certainly don't actually have to think about like really what your value prop is if you're going out and paying brokers just a shit ton of money to give you their customers. And so I think like at some point the music has to stop on those plans, and you're kind of left with like, oh man, like what do we do now?
Yeah, this is a bit of a tangent, but I think everything you're saying about WeWork is a perfect example of our earlier point around COVID changing things and the degree to which structures and behaviors have changed. I recently went to a WeWork and it was awesome. I'd worked in WeWorks pre-pandemic and it was just fine, but it was great being in a WeWork. It was really exciting. I go in 1 to 2 times a week. How do you think about the big debates in the space around like how much have things changed, separate from like the meme like online, like which city is going to be a big thing, because that's a kind of separate thing. But as an investor, so many of the industries you're covering, there are just these could be massive shifts or maybe not massive shifts, right? So for example, everyone's back, not everyone's back, but live events are big again. And that's clearly not a behavior that changed, because there's a lot of predictions around maybe behaviors changing that way. So how do you just think about thinking through that at like a thesis level?
It's so tough. And like, I don't think I'm smart enough to do it at a thesis level. Like, I think it really has to be case by case. So I invested in a company called Seasons recently that does a membership for men's like designer clothing targeted at Gen Zs. A few amazing things happened for them, bad for other people, but amazing things happen. They raised right before the pandemic, and they're just like these gritty founders. And so they survived the pandemic when none of their competitors did. They had all of this time, so they're wide open competitive space. They had essentially a year where nobody was going out or doing anything, but they just were able to build a bunch of their own infrastructure. So they have this like beautiful kind of tech stack that they can build other things on top of. They like super deeply understand their particular consumer. And oh, by the way, now people are going out for the first time in a year, and Gen Z is like dying to go out and dying to show off new fits, and like
everyone looks great. I mean, it's just funny. Like you're walking up, people are looking great right now,
right? Everyone looks great. Everyone's been saving up their money, so like if they have to like go pay a little bit more money to like look a little bit better when they go out, like hell yeah. So I think like looking at the micro, you can see that some of these things like really benefit some companies and really change. I think, Breather with a clean cap table and balance sheet today would do phenomenally well. I think WeWork is positioned, particularly with more kind of mature leadership, to do phenomenally well. I do think, like not judging on the city, but it's really hard this is an N of one situation, but I've talked to a bunch of people as well. Like it's hard for me to picture going back to an office 5 days a week, like mandatorily. Like I understand that some people want to go back sometimes and see people, but I generally think that like things have really changed on that front, and like law firms and banks will make their employees go back. Some engineers are just never going to go back to a company that's going to make them work from an office 5 days a week ever again. I think some companies are going to try to use this as a competitive advantage and like really get good and hire teams to figure out how to employ remote teams, but make it feel like this cohesive culture. Like, do you do these? I saw a company that just did their offsite in like Alaska and got the team together. Like that is so much cooler than having to show up to an office 5 days a week. Like you work together for a couple of weeks in an interesting place, or you like back to the original not boring idea, like build a really nice like kind of clubhouse style office that people can come in and like, interact, and it's designed for meetings, and it's not just designed for sitting at your computer with your headphones on all day. So like, I do think people will go back to physical spaces and all of that, but it will not be mandatorily 5 days a week, all of that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I think probably the big lesson for me and big takeaway in all of everything that I've researched is like nothing ever gets like less crazy. I wrote a piece called Entropy Theory about how just like the world's entropy increases. And then like sometimes people come in and they like bring order to it. So like Napster blew up music, and then Spotify was like, all right, cool, we'll bring order to this. But like the arc of history just gets like more and more and more and more crazy. So to think like, oh, all right, like this was weird, but we're all going back to this like very controlled 9 to 5 in an office kind of thing, just like historically would be an anomaly if that's what ended up happening.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. So something I'm curious about, obviously Not Boring Capital comes out of you building a really excellent newsletter and a clear community of people that are there. You're developing expertise and a thought process, all that stuff. Can you just comment on the general phenomenon of people who are in the quote unquote like creator economy, raising funds, investing? You've got the TikTok kids doing TikTok kid things. I'm showing my degree of age there when I say that, but how do you just think about this broad phenomenon? Because you obviously came from like the tech and startup industries, so it's a little different, but there's just this broader thing of deep interest in this space. And I think the stuff like you're doing is only going to further interest this. So can you just comment on the broader phenomenon?
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I don't want to sound like a boomer on it, but like, yeah, it makes sense for me to do it, right? Because I worked in startups. I write about this very particular industry, and like, this is what I care about and have written about for, a long time and thought about a lot. And so like, it feels like a natural extension. I think of myself more as like a startup person than a creator. And it just happens that like I express that through a newsletter. That said, I think it's fascinating. And I think some of these TikTok stars are going to have like massive returns because the deals that they're able to get with companies because they provide distribution is massive. And so they're not typically raising funds. Like they're typically just making more money than they know what to do with. And then they're investing it in companies. So like one, they don't have to worry about keeping LPs happy. Two, they can do whatever kind of sweetheart deals they want that are really good for themselves. Like I couldn't go out to a company now and say like, give me equity for doing this thing. But like, I'm just like, just don't tell my LPs that I did that. Like everything that I do has to go into the fund. For them, they could say like, cool, yeah, we'll invest 100K, but like give us 5% of the company and then we'll blow you up on TikTok. And like that happens all of the time. And so I think like they can be even a little bit like directionally wrong or like wrong with some of the bets and still make a ton of money because they're just getting such good deals because their distribution for the right companies is really, really, really valuable. But generally, like I think it's just this idea of turning from capital into labor. And like these kids are making more money than they know what to do with. A certain class of creators is making a bunch of money with like super low cost structures. And the obvious thing to do right now when tech companies have just become so valuable is to try to use that influence that you have to be able to invest at the earlier stages. And as long as you're not, a total, I think as long as you're not like very, very bad, as long as you're getting into like pretty good deals and you have a thesis and you can actually help, I think those returns are going to be pretty good. I put something in the Not Boring Capital announcement today that I just looked up yesterday, which the whole thing is crazy. So one, there have been like 243 new unicorns minted since the beginning of the year. So new companies worth $1 billion or more since the beginning of the year, up to 750. So like a third or more of the world's unicorns were created in the past 6 months, which is wild.
Yeah.
All of those 750 unicorns combined. So there's 750 companies, including SpaceX and Stripe and Instacart and even ByteDance, which makes TikTok. All of those companies combined are worth less than Apple. And so one, there's like this higher upside for each individual company if it's easier now to become worth $1 billion. But then two, like if one of those companies at some point becomes as valuable as Apple, and like God knows, like Apple is a powerhouse and that's not easy to do. But if one of those does, then like you're getting 749 companies for free. And so like there is also that just like major upside there as well. So I think despite kind of high prices recently, it's a really good time to be investing in startups. I think tech has just kind of shifted the way that markets work. And like this could be, could bite me in the ass and look like one of those, like this time it's different quotes, but there are just global markets and these business models that have 70 to 90% gross margins, and distribution is like kind of becoming the solved thing. And there's been a decade of startup. Like if you look back on the startups of 2011, there were a lot of like really dumb startups. And I see way fewer really dumb startups now. Like I think founders have learned a lot from the mistakes of the previous generation. They've learned on the good and the bad side. And so they can get really big more quickly. And so I think it's just a really good time to both be building and investing in startups right now. And whatever you can do to get into those deals and then help those companies, I think, God bless you, go do it.
Yeah, no need to name and dunk on, but what would you say the lessons are from 2011, 2012?
It's a good question. I don't actually, I'm not even going to try to make up a good answer on the spot right now. I think if you just like look at some of those companies, like there are a lot of like Uber for X type companies that for a million different reasons wouldn't work, or things trying to become a marketplace or sharing economy that like really like the cost structure in that industry can't support it. Or like, I think there's a lot of like very derivative stuff that like you're just never going to win on as like the ninth competitor to try that same thing in a slightly different industry or whatever else. And the infrastructure wasn't there. So like some of it's not these people's fault. Like they're building what they could with the tools in hand. Now you can plug in Stripe and Twilio and Unit and Lithic and whatever, and like have a working fintech product in a couple of weeks, right? Or maybe not a couple of weeks, but in a few months, you can have like a fully functioning product up and running. And so I think that gives people like a lot more opportunity to experiment on their differentiation versus trying to like rebuild the underlying infrastructure every time. And then like kind of having to come up with an idea that like kind of works with what they know how to do.
Just to double click, but just from a general, like what's the zeitgeist? there is a good point you're making here about the reason why people joke about the Uber per X thing is that sounds like really derivative in a way that isn't like, it's very much just like not the thing now. It's definitely kind of, if someone just walks in saying that, it feels kind of, like there's just maybe it could work, but it feels kind of like someone's kind of missing the underlying point. And there's just like much less of that. So that's just like a really interesting point.
And now, I mean, it's shifted a little bit, right? Like there is Shopify for X and there is Stripe for X. And so it's moved a little bit. And some of those are bad ideas. And then some of those, like I just invested actually in a Stripe for X company that the only reason they say Stripe for X is to communicate what they're doing more clearly. But they have this it's a bunch of like genius 21-year-old kids who are just like absolute hustlers. But they have this like whole plan that is just like absolutely brilliant and they're executing on it. And so you can message something in a clear way and like that's certainly helpful. But I think that founders today have a better understanding of like all of the things that goes into making a big business and like understanding unit economics up front. And like, yeah, I guess like WeWork and even Uber, it's done, well, it's a multi tens of billions of dollar company, but I think was a really good lesson for people on unit economics, which before 2017, 2018, like just really wasn't something that people thought about all that closely, particularly early in a startup's life. So I think as there are more public examples like WeWork, Uber, whatever else, people take that lesson and that just kind of becomes like a table stakes thing that you need to build into your product.
I think the whole thing that this all builds to, and it's actually the piece that helped me really discover your work, is your idea of everyone playing the great online game. And a good way of summing up what this episode is basically like, this is how you are playing the game. So can you explain what the online game is, the underlying actual like deep ideas behind it? Because it's one of those, I found it so compelling because it's very straightforward, but it's also very deep. There's two different levels you could look at it. So it'd be great for you just to articulate it and then like contextualize it within what you're doing.
For sure. So the idea behind the great online game is, I was looking at what we do every day, particularly remote, what I do sitting at a computer, like what we're doing right now. And like what everyone's doing pretty much both personally and professionally and had been doing for the past 18 months is essentially what like the dictionary definition of a video game, which is like manipulating objects on a digital screen. And like, that's all we do. And like, if you click the right buttons in the right order, for me, that's like typing a newsletter. Like if I hit the right things on my keyboard in the right order, I win followers. Or if somebody else like moves the right thing in the right place on Figma, like they get a new design job or, X, Y, and Z.
Quick interjection, because this is me just patting you on the head. I'm not kidding. Reading that line, because you can contextualize this within Slack, that helped me catch up on my like deeply unread Slack messages. I'm like, this is just a game. Just sit down and play for 20 minutes, even though it's not fun. Because that's all you're doing. You're just typing things in and then like that's it. So it's just funny how just reducing it to its core actual concept could be a mental unblocker for people who are terrible at Slack like me.
Totally. And it kind of makes everything a little bit more fun. And everything is like, not for everybody. There are people who are not online and there are people who are, struggling to make ends meet every day. And so like, I am not talking about that and I'm not trying to like minimize the real struggle, but for humanity in general, like things have gotten a lot better. And for a lot of people, like the people who have the time to spend an hour reading, not boring, which is, I guess, by definition, the audience, like for those people, the stakes are not incredibly, incredibly high to go out there and just like really like find that group of people that you think that you're going to resonate with, or like study that passion of yours, or like go start producing something, or like go join that community that you were thinking of doing. Like all these little things, like the risk is like almost nothing to going to do those things. And the upside is really, really big. And so if you do treat it a little bit like a game where it's not life or death, where you can kind of play around, you can reset and like even come on as a pseudonymous, player later on if you mess up the first time, like there's all these things that you can do that are these like really high upside things. Like for me, again, in April last year, I was a failed entrepreneur with a 400 person newsletter. And then over the past year, I've just like, it's not easy. It's not like necessarily fun that like 7 days a week for the past year, I've been writing and doing whatever else. Like it is a full-time job, but I'm like finding the people that I like talking to, and I'm writing about the things that I'm interested in, and I'm getting to meet all these really cool companies. And so like just by kind of putting myself out there and just being like, I don't know, like this is kind of a game. Let me just like write fun stuff. I'll do the Mickey Mouse Club. I'm not going to take myself too seriously. Like good things kind of end up happening. I need to be really careful in these situations to not, again, like kind of extrapolate from me where there's survivorship bias. I'm just like, oh, cool. Yeah. Like things went well. I've run a newsletter and then I run a venture fund now. But I do think like there's all sorts of examples on big scales, small scales, whatever else of people just like either marginally or in a meaningful way improving their situation by taking things less seriously, putting themselves out there. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about the piece was that it's like all about clout and chasing followers and like doing all those kinds of things. And like that is not at all true. Like I think you lose the great online game if you just like shit post in people's replies all the time in order to get followers. Like that is not what it's about. But it is about that if you're doing the thing that you want to be doing and like talking about the things you want to be talking about and finding the people that you want to be associating with, there's like, 4 billion people in the world online. So your opportunity to like go find that right thing and just kind of play and build your guild is just so much bigger than it's ever been before. So it's not about followers. It could be about finding that like one person in a Discord over there who you really resonate with. And then you guys want to like go either build something together or just like you found a best friend. Like, I don't know, just like, it just feels like this digital thing in which you're the main player. And you can play that in all sorts of different ways, not just try to get famous.
This just bring up an obvious question. You actually wrote about this in terms of your process and your writing. How much longer can you do this 7 days a week with barely any vacations? Because there's obviously this broader conversation in the creator economy space about burnout, but I read the piece and I was just stressed out afterwards because I do the deep end. I have my own podcast on the side. I was thinking like, man, I'm not working like half as hard as you are. And so there's a bit of a demerit for myself, but at the same time, I'm like, do I want to work as hard as Packy?
No, you're doing it right.
So I guess the question is like, you have a young child, you're married. Like, how do you think of this process for you long term? So for example, thinking of investing, that's like a 10-year journey. Like how long are you going to continue writing this newsletter at this pace, the way you do it within this model?
Yeah, it's interesting, like zero complaints on all of this, but I've also kind of built this tangled web where like now I have a fund and a lot of the value that I offer to companies and LPs is that I have this newsletter. And so if I have the fund, then I need to do the newsletter. If I do the newsletter, then I need to actually make money on the newsletter, which means I need to do sponsored deep dives, which means like, and I can't do sponsored deep dives and write about things if I'm not just like going to pour my all into it. I'm not going to be like, yeah, just pay me a bunch of money and I'll like, I don't know, come up with something in a couple hours about your company. Like I really want it to be great for each company that I invest in or write about or whatever else. And so it does create a lot of work. And the interesting thing on the creator side, like my wife is an ops person. And so she's always like, oh, well, you can like look at your calendar and break down like how to block things and like where you can insert people into the process. And there's so much of this process that is just me, right? Like even sales calls, like I'm able to get higher rates with sponsors if I'm the one talking to the sponsor, because like that's part of the fun is that they read the newsletter and they want to talk and all of that. So it's really tough to figure out like where to remove myself from the equation. I think probably where I end up like flexing down a little bit is, last month I wrote 3 Thursday pieces in a row, which meant that I was writing like 6 pieces in 21 days or something crazy like that. And like that can't happen. So now I'm really like, and it's tough because I have to tell founders that I've invested in like, no, I can't write this piece until October, but I really need to stick to like, 2 Thursday pieces a month or else I'm just going to go crazy. And so there's like little things like that. And then I think on the fun side is where I can actually bring in some help, at least on like, the administrative side of it and helping portfolio companies and all of that. But I love the writing part and I love talking to founders. And so like none of it's bad. It's just really figuring out like what the kind of highest leverage, most enjoyable stuff is so that I am not working 7 days a week and have a wedding. And I'm like, oh man, I can't believe like we have to go to a wedding. Like how am I actually going to get my job done? Like those are the tough parts that I need to figure out how to get a little bit more balance on.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that's interesting here is that what excites people about the whole creator/passion economy issue set is it's an example of decentralization and people being individuals and you not needing to go to a big fund to say, hey, can I write a newsletter for you guys? And then maybe like get some deal flow. Like you can just do this. But obviously you're also being very realistic about not quote unquote the downsides because you're obviously enjoying yourselves, but the very like the balancing act and the cost here. Do you think there's any structural things that could change around this, especially in spaces in the creator economy where there isn't just like a clear return thing. So, for example, you put in 7 days a week of, 7 days of work a week and you get a fund. But there are plenty of people in these spaces who are excited about this model who don't have an industry where that's quite how it works. So do you ever think about the structures? And maybe this is people bundling, working as a collective. Like how do you think about this?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the industry and what you're trying to go for on all those kinds of stuff. I think the work that like the Dark Star group is doing on Mirror, where they're trying to build like kind of a media DAO. I think things like that are really, really interesting, where if you have kind of 3 or 4 people who have equal voices and you're a Dark Star subscriber as much as you are a subscriber to any one of those people, then they can take pressure off of each other and take turns and bring people in. And because of the DAO structure, like figure out how to properly incentivize them to do work and not make it too heavy or too lightweight where they're not actually getting paid. Like, I think that some of the Web3 stuff is really interesting in this space, and just letting, I wrote this thing about the cooperation economy and liquid super teams, where I think that these structures can exist where people come together and just, work together on particular projects and float away. I don't think there's a great solve to all of this. So honestly, we're like, if you really, really want to get big, like it just is a lot of work, or you have to be really, really good, which, you have to be like just pretty naturally talented, or, if I were a phenomenal graphic designer, like maybe I could just sell, very expensive NFTs. But even people who's been making millions and millions and millions of dollars was doing this for like years. And he was a employed designer, but as an individual graphic artist, like no one really cared. And so like even the ones where it seems like there's just these like huge hits of money were years and years and years in the making. So I don't know if there's like a really easy path or something structural, but I do think that there's way more ways to make a good living off of creating in a group of people than there ever were before. And so if that's what you're going for, like 100% you can add your very individual skill to a group of people. Like maybe you join a part of this startup called Maple that literally just like is SaaS or honey for SaaS. And it's a bunch of people who are all part-time doing it on the side. If there's a really good designer who lives on the other side of the world, but is down to like just kind of come work on this for a few days a week, like they can get equity in this company. And so I think there are going to be opportunities like that where you don't need to be a superstar, but you need to have like a very particular skill and the ability to kind of find the ways to slot that skill into groups of people who need that skill. And then I think there's a really good way of making a living without having to, it's more about the skill than the person in that point. And then I think it's less pressure probably.
Yeah. And speaking of making money, you run Not Boring based on advertising. You're on Substack, but you're not quite doing the Substack business model by not charging subscriptions, of which Substack takes a percentage. How do you think people in all these spaces should think about the advertising versus subscription debate? Because the thing that's interesting for me at a Substack level is a large part of Substack's actual articulation of the newsletter model is that actually at an almost ideological level, advertising doesn't always incentivize the best content and the best work, and that actually building communities and building like actual quality subscription models are a better part. But I think you're doing a really good job of balancing. I think that's because you have some personal incentives here. So you obviously can't turn this into a click farm or else the fund collapses. But how on a broader level do you think people should think about that debate as they are looking to determine what they're trying to do?
Yeah. I mean, I think any of these kind of holy war type things, like just all need more nuance. Like there is a world in which like, Lenny Rachitsky does something very similar-ish, has a fund, writes a newsletter, and he does it subscription and he kills it on the subscription side. I think the difference between me and Lenny is that his is very focused on product and growth. And it's like a very clear value prop that like, if you're a person who works in product, like you need to pay to subscribe to Lenny's newsletter and you need to join the community, and there will be job opportunities and upskilling and like all of these different things that come with like all these very particular things that come with paying for Lenny's newsletter. And so he is like absolutely killing it on his newsletter. And that's the right model for him. For me, I think it's so diffuse that like, we talked about the fact that we're talking about Schumpeter and the Mickey Mouse Club and a healthcare company and like X, Y, and Z thing all over the place, where one, I think it's hard to get your company to pay for that. Two, when you're like looking at your credit card statement at the end of the month, they're like, why do I pay for this? Like, this is good. I like it, but like, what does it actually do for me? And I think that's a tougher thing for people to do. So I don't think my conversion to paid would be as high. And so for me, the sponsorship model makes sense, particularly because, you know, the deep dives are the big kind of like revenue driver for Not Boring. And so with that, I do better for sure than I would have done on the subscription side. But this was not like a religious thing. This was just being very clear with myself and honest about the fact that if I wanted to go more broad and just like do my own thing, I couldn't ask people to pay for one thing. Like, you know, there would have been a time in the middle of last year where I was writing about public company stocks very often. And so someone might have subscribed because they wanted financial analysis and like a hot stock tip. And now they'd be like, wait, you're writing about like the great online game and like raising a venture fund, like this is not what I paid for. And so I think by being kind of free and letting sponsors pay, one, people get good content for free. And two, I'm able to kind of explore and it's free. So, you know, people don't have to unsubscribe because of me changing my mind sometimes.
That's really interesting. I think a good way of summing up what you're saying is that if people were to subscribe to you, it'd be much more in the, hey, Packy's great. I want to support Packy's work and I want to help Packy pay for his ability to write about random things he's interested in, which is totally different from the business corporate expensing use case. So so what you've done is you've found a model that allows you to go broad as you're interested in, but still actually support things. So I think that's a good note for people. So for our last section here, obviously, because this is an On Deck podcast, you're an On Deck fellow. The education space is like obviously of huge mutual interest. It'd be great just in these last few minutes to just get your broad thoughts on the education space as let's just say a founder who made an attempt in this space. And then now just as someone who's looking at, I'm sure a variety of businesses are thinking about this, because if we're looking at the whole start of the conversation around COVID and you've just had this 1-year experiment with a bunch of different directions and theses and everything, how do you just think about the space broadly?
Yeah. So my start to your point of thinking on the space was like thinking about, you know, it's a bummer that you graduate college and then you're like kind of just done learning and you have to go to work. And so that's why I tried to do Not Boring Club. That was the wrong model. I think On Deck has tried to do something very similar, which is thesis wise very similar, which is like to learn. It actually really helps to be in a group of people who are going through the same thing as you, and actually you should probably make it more practical. So instead of learning like startup theory, you're building a startup and then you have a bunch of people coming in and telling you, you know, here's how you do that particular thing or that particular thing, or like maybe here's how you think about your deck or your business plan or X, Y, and Z. And I think that learning is just way easier to absorb once you hit a certain age if you're actually going through the thing and need to apply it in person. So I love the cohort-based model. I love kind of like practical applications of education. I don't know. I mean, I think Harvard will be fine. I think Stanford will be fine. Like those will be fine. I think there's a lot in the middle that just like really stands to be disrupted. I'm not going to break any new ground, I don't think, by saying like, you know, particularly for people familiar with On Deck, that like if you break up the credentials from the courses and like separate those things out, then like each vertical can be attacked a little bit better. I think in the US, it's like, you know, during COVID, it was a very pressing problem that we needed to figure out how to educate people remotely. And I think that good strides have been made in that direction. There's parts in the world where people still can't go back to a classroom, where like, you know, they can't afford to go to a phenomenal, you know, university or prep school or whatever else, like where there are real advantages and where it's hard to find a great local teacher, like where there are real advantages to figuring out how to build the best online educational experience for those people. And I think if you can figure that out, like what bigger unlock is there than being able to educate, you know, the 7 billion people in the world a little bit better? Like that's absolutely massive. And so I think like this might be a problem where maybe almost Tesla-like, there's some like expensive kind of high-end solutions in the US that maybe get less expensive over time, but that, you know, unlike Tesla, you know, maybe a lot of that demand is going to come internationally, where it is like really a 10x improvement in the way that people are educated. There's a ton of challenges, like, you know, the adherence to online courses is tiny. People drop off before they graduate all of the time, but people are coming up with creative new solutions to that. You know, Masterclass, I think, is interesting. I synthesis school at an earlier age, turning school into a video game, like that obviously is going to get my attention. But I think there's a bunch of different things that like over time in the next 10 years, this is another situation where like things are not going to get less crazy. People are not just going to go back to like sitting in a classroom, learning out of a textbook for 5 days a week, when all of the world's education is sitting there online, and we just need better ways to kind of deliver it and personalize it.
Yeah, I just really like you delineating the US domestic case from the broader worldwide case, because my general, I mean, I'm 10 years out of, high school and all that. So I have no idea what Zoom school was like. So I feel as if in the US market, just online education just took a huge bun rap because it was just so jarring. It was obviously a terrible experience, and that in-person experience is just going to be so clearly superior, definitely for the next year. Like I'd love to actually meet the high schooler who's desperate to get into some like online only option right now.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at a broader case of like, once again, your point about the internet, there's 4 billion people who 3 billion of which likely don't have that same access level. That's a really thing to look at. So for the last question here, and you can take this any direction you want, what is something, an industry, a space that you are excited about, especially as you're moving your fund forward?
Yeah. So an area that I've just been super excited about generally and not boring just has been Web3 broadly. I haven't done a ton of investments in the space yet. I'm still like trying to get my bearings on what's investable and what's not, and what just sounds really, really cool and what's not. I've made a couple of investments. I invested in Mirror. I'm investing in Syndicate Protocol, another company that I alluded to earlier, but I can't say which one. So I'm making a few investments there, but I don't know, the way that I think about that space, because I know that there can be like a lot of like woo stuff around crypto, but is like the very bull case for decentralized products is that you just look at the profits that companies like Facebook and Google and all these companies, like centralized companies, and nothing, like I'm an investor in these companies, like nothing wrong with these companies at all. But I'm just saying like the economic opportunity is taking those profits and distributing them to users in the form of something that like also makes the underlying kind of token of that product more valuable. Like there's just a shitload of money that could potentially be redistributed back to the people, which I think is really, and also gives you kind of like customer acquisition tools to play with, and like network effects can like really kick in meaningful scale. So I don't know exactly how to invest in it, but I'm super fascinated to kind of continue to dive into Web3 stuff.
I love, to close, how you put that. It all just sounds cool. We had Jared Dicker from Churn Group on the show, and he's describing Web3 products. Like, man, that just sounds sick. So basically, don't give me a big fund, because I'll basically just say, that sounds cool, man. That's cool. And you're just just basically throw a bunch of money away, because I think in Web3 especially, everything just sounds really cool. Like I've yet to hear a not quote unquote not cool or a like boring Web3 use case articulation here. So I definitely think that there's some useful advice for people to separate the what sounds cool from the what's actually a useful thing perspective you're giving.
Totally. I mean, that's the tough part. And that's why, because I know myself and I know that I love thinking about this stuff. So that's why I'm not doing too much investing in the space yet, because there's so much that I'll be like, oh man, that's really cool. And I don't know exactly yet, like just what the go-to-market looks like and how to build kind of the early stages of the business. So we'll see, but more to come there.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect place to leave us. Packy, thank you so much for joining. Where should people check out your work and everything that you're launching?
Yeah, notboring.co or at Packy M on Twitter.
Great. Well, thanks for joining, and thank you to our live audience as well. Decent number of people here. Really appreciate that, and a great constant attendance rate. So thank you so much, everyone. We're looking forward to doing this more in the future.
Thanks so much, Marshall.
Thanks.